Hi, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas, Texas on Wednesday, January the 7th. And welcome to our commentary. Well, I have a post over at the American Thinker today talking about Cuba, and it coincides with the video that we did last night. It's right before this one. I would recommend that you check it out. It's a video that we did with Mylene Salavarria, who is a great friend of our show, a lady who I value a great deal. You know, she's such an interesting person because we were both born in Cuba, of course. I'm a little older than she is. I think that's obvious. But nevertheless, I grew up in the early days of the revolution. She actually had a chance to grow up and live and go to school and work, during, more advanced stage of what they call the revolution. So I got to experience some things that she never did, and she got to experience some things that I never did. So it's always very interesting to speak to someone like that from Cuba, but with a different experience, and that's what she brings to the conversation. That's why she's such an interesting person to talk to. But we talked a little bit about what's going to happen in Cuba. Change is coming. I think that's very obvious. The change is coming. The question is, when will it happen? My guess is it's going to happen sooner than later, but it will happen. But the real question is, how does the change happen? Okay, I mean, it's one thing to, arrest the leader of Cuba and bring him to the United States like we did with Maduro, but the situation is a little bit different than the situation in Venezuela. The problem in Cuba is you don't really have someone to take over, because one of the problems with the kind of dictatorship that the Castro brothers created in Cuba is that they really didn't develop people to replace them, because they were never planning to be replaced. So it becomes a situation where Cuba really doesn't have, a generation of Cubans who could take over the government. I mean, there are some people there, of course, who would take over just because they're the next in line type of thing. But do they have the credibility of the Cuban people? Do they have the support? Can they actually govern? And I don't think they can. So it becomes a very interesting situation. How does a Trump administration handle, let's say, a change like that in Cuba? And that's what we talked about last night. One of the things that I suggested to Mylene, and let me bring this to your attention now, is that I think what could happen in Cuba, and I would welcome this, would be for the United States to basically run Cuba for about 3 to 5 years. That is exactly what happened after the Spanish-American War back in 1898. Cuba at the time was had finally defeated the Spanish rule, but Cuba was not ready. There was nothing in Cuba. The economy was devastated. I mean, the sugar fields were a disaster. The country was in terrible shape. Let's put it that way. There was nothing there. And the United States came in, took over, and for the next 3 or 4 years, the United States ran the country. There was a governor of Cuba, I guess. I don't know who it was, but there was somebody responsible for Cuba who basically worked for the United States. And then eventually there were elections in Cuba. There was a constitution. There were elections. And Cuba had a president in 1902. And from there on, Cuba entered into its own period of civilian rule. I think something like that may very well have to happen, where the United States comes in and says, look, we're going to help you run the country. Here are, people who will help you bring back the sugar industry, for example, the tourism industry. Look, the entire infrastructure in Cuba has to be rebuilt. I mean, they have done nothing to build the infrastructure. Look at the situation with the power plants, all these electricity blackouts that they have. Much of it is that the power plants just don't work anymore. So you're going to have to rebuild power plants. You're going to have to rebuild highways. You're going to have to, the whole country has to be redone. And the only country that I can think of who can do that is the United States. And I do think at this stage of the game that most Cubans would be willing to go along with that and support that kind of an operation with the United States. You also have over 1 million Cubans, 1.5 million Cuban Americans like me, who I think would help out. And we would help out in different ways. Obviously, the easiest way we would help out is by traveling to Cuba and spending our money there, which would be an inflow of dollars that the country would need. So that would be, that would be one way that we would all help out. I think you're going to see a lot of American industry interested in Cuba. The Cuban market, I think, could very well be developed for American consumer goods and all of that. So there's a tremendous opportunity. That's what I'm trying to say for businesses to go into Cuba, and then eventually Cuba becoming the independent country that it was for so many years. So I think change is coming. The big concern that we had in that conversation with Mylene is who's going to take over. I think there's nobody in Cuba who can do it. That much I safely feel that way. But some kind of a deal with the United States, where the United States helps out, and in essence runs the country for 3 to 4 years. I think that would be really favorable for Cuba. So we'll have to see. We'll have to see how everything works out. But change is coming. I have no doubt in my mind that changes are coming to Cuba. When exactly, I'm not going to tell you because I don't know. But it's coming fast. It's coming fast. That much I can tell you. Well, there was a terrible shooting today up in Minneapolis. A lady who was shot by an ICE agent. I saw the video. I'm not an expert on these things, but I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt here to the ICE agent. I think he was acting in self-defense. The video that I saw clearly showed that the lady driving that car was out of control and put the agent's life in harm. So he had every right to defend himself. So there's going to be an investigation, obviously, and that has to wait. We'll have to wait for the results, But the most disappointing thing today, frankly, from Minneapolis is the mayor of Minneapolis and the completely irresponsible way that he handled this terrible incident. He goes on this press conference and he starts blasting ICE. And he even uses bad language to tell ICE where to go or get the, out of Minneapolis. Well, first of all, that's not his choice. He doesn't decide whether ICE leaves Minneapolis or not. ICE is a federal agency. And the last time I checked, the federal law is supreme over the city of Minneapolis or the state of Minnesota. I think the mayor of Minneapolis could have done a lot better today. I watched him and then I watched the police chief there in Minneapolis, and I thought the police chief was a lot more responsible in what he said. He said, look, I don't have all the information. Let's wait for the investigation. I thought the police chief was responsible, but the mayor was a joke, a total, complete joke. I don't know, honestly, how somebody like that can even govern a city. But anyway, I guess he was elected, and that's what's happening in many of these blue cities. They have these mayors who are absolutely ridiculous. But I hope there is no trouble tonight. I hope that everybody keeps their cool. But from the video that I saw, and again, I'm sure there's going to be an investigation. Maybe more videos will come out. From what I've seen so far, I think that the ICE agent was acting in self-defense. If somebody throws a car at you, you have to protect yourself. That's only reasonable. A couple of things that I wanted to mention here at the end. There's a lot of talk about Greenland. And you have to understand why we're talking about Greenland. It has tremendous strategic value to the United States, military value, that is, national security value. And we live at a time right now where, China is developing a submarine fleet. They're also developing a navy, and they want to compete with the United States. And the way you compete with China is to have, obviously, your own navy, but also having different places around the world where your navy can stop and operate from. And Greenland is an absolutely strategic place for that purpose. I was reading today that President Truman and President Eisenhower at one time had called for some kind of an arrangement with Greenland. And I think that's fascinating because here we have a Republican president and a Democrat president basically wanting to do the same thing, which means to me is that they were both thinking about the national security of the country and not some partisan politics. So I think Trump is right on Greenland. We should sit down with the Netherlands, I think Denmark, yeah, and negotiate some kind of a deal where we can have a military base in Greenland, and we can make it part of NATO. so that it protects more than just the United States. So I think that's important. I think NATO, something should be done about NATO. A quick thing: the Venezuelan situation is still developing. I think it's too soon, frankly, to know how it's all going to turn out. It's very, very important, of course, that we find a transition in Venezuela so that we can put in office people who are elected by the Venezuelan people. So hopefully that can happen. That can happen soon. And a little bit of history here on this day in 1959. Speaking of Cuba, in 1959, this would have been 8 days after the collapse of Batista. The United States recognized the new government in Cuba, which at the time was not the government of Castro. He was not officially in the government. There was a president named Manuel Urrutia, who had become president with the departure of Batista. And he was, I believe, technically the president of Cuba for several years. But of course, once they named Castro prime minister, he became the face of the new government. But a lot about Cuba today, to say the least. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day, everybody. This is Silvio Canto in Dallas. And don't forget to listen to or watch that video with Mylene. I think you're going to like it a great deal. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a good day.